So my journey in philanthropy started when I was maybe in 8th grade, and I lived in Southfield, and we had the Southfield Community Foundation, and my older sister was a part of YAC, the Youth Advisory Committee to the Community Foundation, and I wanted to do everything just like her. And so I would just kind of sit in on meetings that she went to and had no idea what it was about. And then as a freshman in high school, got involved more closely with the work, and it was an experience to me that was very different from other extracurricular activities. I was one of those super involved students in high school, but it was a little bit different because not only were we doing community service work, but there was also this whole grant making component, which nobody else was doing. So it was obviously very cool at the time. And I kind of just, stayed involved through high school and found myself in that work. It made sense to me. It was my way of impacting the community that, the geography of where I lived and the people that I really cared about. And so subsequently, I stayed involved through the CMF network of YACs, and I was involved in the statewide YAC Leadership Board, MCFIP. And after that, I interned for CMF, and then I worked for CMF, so I kind of did the full progression of that whole YACer growing up in that world. And then worked, after I graduated from grad school, worked at CMF as a public policy fellow. And that kind of exposed me to foundations all across the state. And I knew that I definitely wanted to stay in Southeast Michigan, wanted to be in Detroit, and wanted to stay in philanthropy. And the opportunity came up with the Community Foundation for Southeast Michigan. So that's where I am now. I guess I didn't have a full understanding of organized philanthropy. So I'd always seen, my parents or friends and, charitable giving, doing charitable things was always something I was exposed to. But the concept of organized philanthropy, that there is a foundation or that there are several foundations out there that do work in particular issue areas, that make grants, that was, in a formal way, was new to me. And then being involved as a young person with youth-related grants was also new. The service part was something I was exposed to through other clubs, but then the fact that we were doing service with groups that we made grants to was just completely different. So that was all very new to me at the time. Once I figured out what we were doing and what our role was supposed to be or could be, I think it all started to make sense. I think my experience would not have been the same without the help and the guidance of our advisors. So we had a lot of adults who were allies to us, who served as advisors to our grant making, and they were just the right balance of involved in our work. So they would serve as resources. They wouldn't make the decisions for us, but would help us understand all angles of how we could make decisions. And so there was a lot of learning with peers and among peers in managing those relationships. And additionally, we, as a YAC, you're a part of a community foundation. So we had the resources of our entire board of trustees who were very prominent leaders in the community in various sectors. So as my junior and senior year, because of Michigan's great laws, I could serve on the board of the community foundation. So I was a trustee. So I was 16 and 17 serving on this board of a community foundation, which was that was my first time during that time, was my first time being on an official board where I had a vote and I could have some type of influence. I probably value that experience more now, knowing that I had done it so long ago versus when I was there, because it was like, of course I would do this kind of thing, right? But now I'm like, whoa, I was a very young person on a board that I would like to be on as an adult. I think about it that way. So there was a lot of learning from the adults in terms of a more formalized way of how organized philanthropy works, the management of that, the finances, all of those things that I probably wouldn't have got just trying to figure it out by myself. So I can tell you about my freedom as a YACer through a couple of examples. So when I was during my tenure in YAC and maybe years before and after, Southfield was working to build a youth center. And this is something that was, in the making for years. You can look at old minutes and you would see like 10 years, 15 years prior to my participation that was something that the city wanted and community members wanted. And so it had a few false starts and a lot of momentum at finite periods of time, and then it would kind of die down as leadership changed. So then during, there was a few of us on my YAC that really, we were like, this has to happen, we're gonna make this happen. And it didn't happen during our time, it happened later, but it still happened. And the freedom there was, the benefit of Southfield is that all of the offices were like co-located in a certain municipal complex. So we had the mayor, the city administrator, and then the community foundation was just like a block down. And so I remember a few summers, I would just kind of walk into the mayor's office and the city administrator's office and just say, oh, I need this thing. And maybe at the time, looking back now, they were maybe shocked that a 15, 16-year-old cared enough to want to go meet with the mayor or city administrator. But they obliged for everything. And there were things that I could do kind of I was attached to no politics. I brought nothing with me other than I'm just a kid who cares about the community. And so did my peers, right? So, and then we came with the trusted organization. We were with the community foundation, so people knew that we were legit in that way. But now I think about like, okay, if I wanted a meeting with the mayor or a city administrator of some city, what kind of protocol would I have to go through to even get on that calendar? And then there were no rules in that way. I mean, even the advisors that I worked with maybe had to follow certain rules, but I could just kind of do it. And to this day, no one said that there was a problem with anything that we did, and many, through efforts of many people, years later, the Teen Center opened. But there was a lot of pushing that we were able to do. And again, back to the adults who cared and allowed that space. I think that that's something that is maybe not mentioned enough, but there were times where our board chair of the community foundation would present to city council and I would be up there with him. And that's something that you don't see a lot. You don't see that priority of saying, okay, well, it really is a community foundation, but then these young people are the ones organizing. They should be here too. And so I got that exposure at a very young age as well. And I definitely got away with a lot of things that I think as an adult, when you think about what you're attached to, the politics of anything, what organization you represent, there's so many things you have to think about before showing up and how you can show up. And when I was younger, I didn't have to. Maybe I should have, but I wasn't thinking about it that way. The Teen Center will definitely be up there. That was something that there were so many obstacles to get that to happen, and the YAC movement overcame those obstacles, and that it was a project of the YAC was a really big deal. And that's something that maybe not many people know now, but those who were involved over the last 10, 15 years really know that was something that young people made happen. Of course, in partnership with many adults, but that was kind of spurred by that. I'll cheat and tell you another one. So in Southfield, we had organized every year a youth diversity symposium, and it was, in its time, was a very big deal. And we would get hundreds, I think in the best year we got maybe 700 young people from all across the state to have a day-long discussion on diversity, whatever it meant in that time period. So we talked about Supreme Court cases, we talked about local issues, and all facilitated by other high school students, the small group activities, and we brought in speakers. And it was just something, again, looking back now, I can think wow, that was a pretty big deal that young people kind of had were the momentum to propel that work. Because again, if I think about today, organizing an 800-person conference, it comes with a different set of expectations. The points in time where I think I was frustrated by the work was, one, when our participation was low. So we would kind of go in waves of how many people would be a part of YAC. So on a good year, we'd have 40 people, which is pretty significant for a city like Southfield in terms of size. And then as people we would all of a sudden graduate a bunch of seniors, and then that recruitment. And I think that recruitment issue is something that YACs across the state still face, of how do we get that good balance of people who care about the community, who are of different ages, represent different demographics, different, diversity in thought. How do we get them all in a room together? And some years we had that great balance, and other years we just really struggled with just recruitment, because it's all about how do you market this as a cool club to join, and how do you show young people that this is a place you can make an impact, and it's kind of logistically it's outside of school, and so it causes some other challenges. So that was maybe one of the low points. I think another low point would be if the communication between young people and adults, our adult advisors, was not as strong as it could have been. I think that really reduced morale, and to no particular, no one's fault, but I think there were times where And I remember this, the YAC is definitely, it's an advisory committee of the Community Foundation. And there were points in time where we kind of felt very empowered to be we kind of felt like our own entity. We thought that, like, people don't know the Community Foundation, they know the YAC, and that was our pride in that. And so there would be points in time where we had to understand our relationship to the Community Foundation and communicate a little bit better. I think, YAC really taught me, because I told you about the waves of how we'd have a lot of participation and then low participation, and just managing that, really taught me that a good leader isn't the person that does everything, but the person who sets things up in such a way that if I left tomorrow, this would thrive, whatever the this is, And I think about that a lot now. It's not about necessarily my ability to accomplish something, but it's my ability to help set the framework so that the task can be accomplished whether or not I'm there. And that's how I think about leadership a little bit differently now. The way the work has made me open up my eyes to how I think about diversity is that we work with several, our nonprofit partners are all across the region, and each of them has very unique needs based on the type of work they do, where they're located. And I think I personally feel like it's my job to be able to effectively communicate that to our board members, to our advisory committee members. And I think the way I've thought about diversity is, everybody shows up to the table in a different way. And it's that level of being able to clearly share to others what the needs are, because I believe that everybody is well-intentioned, and sometimes there can be these barriers in understanding what diversity and inclusiveness actually mean, because there just might not be that awareness that this is actually a problem here, and this is actually the need, and this is actually a success of this community. And I think people might just not know. They might come to the table just not understanding, and so being able to communicate that has been very eye-opening in terms of, not really punishing people for not understanding, but really helping bring them along with me on the journey of understanding how nonprofits work. Absolutely, and I think when you hit on the word of organized philanthropy, and I would have to kind of give a shout out to CMF and M&A and the Johnson Center, organizations that have been set up to facilitate that collaboration. And I used to work for CMF, and that collaboration, that's what was happening every single day. And at that point, I could see how organizations like those could help facilitate relationships that people might not be able to access on their own. So being a member of any one of those groups afforded you some access to saying, well, who else is doing this project? Can you put me in touch with 10 people who do this? And I was that person who could do that at that time. And so now I'm in a place where I'm calling on those same resources to say, okay, now I'm thinking about this. Who in the state is even doing this? Can I have these contact information? And we do that, and people do it so often. And in these points of time where we can meet, whether it's anybody's annual conference or some type of convening, we're talking about issues that we all care about, and we're figuring out what collaboration means. And sometimes collaboration ends up in funding collaboratives in my world that, everyone's putting in some amount of money to achieve a particular task. And other times it might just be informally gathering some peers and saying, how do you think about this work? What does this mean for you? Or, we're a regional funder, and so I'm often asking people on the west side of the state or the northern side, how do you think about these issues, and what does the need look like for you, or what do the assets look like for you? And so whether it's informal or formal, and often facilitated by, our statewide organizations, it's very important to my work, and I see it all the time. So I think the best example to give about this is actually through YAC. So when I worked at CMF, I would get phone calls all the time about how do you guys do youth philanthropy? How are you so successful in Michigan? And people all across the state wanted to know what made us go, and I think the first, obviously through partnerships with the Kellogg Foundation, talking about permanently endowed funds made this happen. But then also that there was this network. It wasn't just that everyone was working in isolation. So when I, go to other states and we're talking about the success of certain programs, I can often come back and say, well, Yackers from all across the state meet once a year. There's hundreds of them, and they talk about their projects, and they talk about what they're doing, and a place like CMF facilitates that space. or, in terms of the foundations at large, we get together quarterly or monthly and we talk about these things. And I think Michigan, I think everybody knows that Michigan has a very robust network of nonprofit and foundation partners. And I think it's important that, I'm always talking about how none of us are working in isolation, and that we're always calling each other to say, what are you doing? How can we be a part of that? So I think in terms of the giving side of philanthropy, the charitable giving, I think what's changed over time is, and even in my own lifetime, I can tell you, when I was younger, I used to think that being charitable or being a donor to something meant that you had a lot of money, and that was something I could do when I was much older. So when I'm 65 or 70 and I've retired and I can give away money, this is what I'm gonna do. And I think as I've grown up through philanthropy, have seen that the trends are changing, that people want to feel immediately connected to an issue or something that's happening in the community, and want to feel like that $5, $10, $50, whatever donation is actually going to make a difference somewhere. And so I think foundations are also, especially community foundations, are paying attention to that. And have to, right? And have to figure out how to cater to some of those. Of course, we need those $1 million donors to do the work that we do, but there's also a space for younger people who want to feel like they're a part of the work. And I think a lot of those people come out of the YAC movement who say, I did this as a 10th grader and I feel some desire to give something. And it's starting there. So I think that's something that's changing, over time with a new wave of younger people. And I think with me, there's a handful of us like me who went through YAC and now are at a foundation in Michigan, which is really nice to see that, which will only grow over time, I think. So, as much as I said we do great collaborative work, which I believe, I think there's a lot more space for increased collaboration, not just among foundations or among nonprofits, but between both. And I think that a lot of that is kind of stifled because of power dynamics, and that there is this kind of like a grantor-grantee kind of divide that often comes up, and that's sometimes inevitable, and sometimes we can totally be fixing that, right? And so I think that I would change, you're giving me a magic wand, so I can change structures, right, of how we're built inherently to think that someone has to be doing the giving and someone has to be doing the receiving, right? Can we be partners at the table? We don't have to sit across from the table, we can all sit next to each other, right? And so figuring out how we can kind of let those barriers down and work more closely together, because too often those power dynamics get in the way of effective work. Yeah, I happily will name Rob Collier, because he has been someone who I've always stayed in touch with him and he's always stayed in touch with me. And that meant that throughout high school, throughout college, throughout grad school, there were points in time where I just talked to him and told him what I was doing. And I think that there's a lot of value in those conversations where you don't need anything or want anything at that time. And too often I think people forget that those are important to maintain. And so Rob has been, obviously an influential leader across nationally, globally, but I think something about, it feels good to know that when you're a young person, to know that there is an adult who cares about the work that you're doing and wants to see you succeed. And that could look like very different things over time. And so when I was in high school, it meant, encouraging me to think about McFIP and then continue to think about CMF employment, but then later was to think a lot bigger and to figure out where to connect me with. And so it's really nice to have, role models like that. So I think I mentioned this before, that recruitment has been an ongoing struggle. Having been a part of the YAC movement, having helped facilitate a lot of conversations in that space, recruitment seems to be the one huge barrier to growing. And it's because, how do we message ourselves? How do we brand ourselves to talk about youth philanthropy in a really effective way? And so I think it is, I definitely know for a fact it's growing, and it has grown significantly over time. And as more, I think, more spotlight for YAC work among, the community foundation world is only going to elevate the presence of what YAC is. And now there's people, I mean, even our YAC at Southeast Michigan has just grown tremendously. You know, it's just really devoting resources to do very targeted outreach and know that you need to do a specific thing to get more YAC members. I think through other advisory committees, sometimes they're just very targeted asks and you can get people to, you know, help you out in certain ways. But through YAC, it takes a lot more, it takes a lot of effort to be very thoughtful about bringing a group of young people together, especially in our case, we're a regional funder. And so how do we bring that group together? And so I think it's just getting more people involved means community foundations putting in more resources to be even more, I know that they are very thoughtful, but even more thoughtful about how to get diverse voices to the table. I think that the most successful YACs across the state have had a good balance of all of those things. So the formal aspect of grant making, plus service, plus other leadership opportunities throughout, all combined, that addresses the need. I think that if you just brought a bunch of young people to the table and said, here's a proposal, read it, you get to make a decision, that's cool, that does one thing, but it doesn't address all of the other needs. And then you say, okay, well, here, we want you to go talk about this grant in front of our board, go do that thing over there, and then, oh, we want you also to volunteer in this space. I think getting that kind of holistic aspect to philanthropy, YAC is a great place to do it, because otherwise, you kind of, as you grow up into the professional space, you sometimes either end up on one side or the other, or one place or another, and you can't do all of those things at the same time. So YAC is a great place to be able to be doing that. I think there have been a lot of underrepresented communities in participating in organized philanthropy, and it's not because necessarily the resources aren't there, but the rationale for understanding why my $1,000, my $10,000, why it matters and what the impact is, hasn't always been clear. So in my thoughts of how philanthropy works, anywhere, it's, okay, well, if we really want young people to be participating, let's go target the young people and say, well, we're not asking for $1 million today, but this much money or this much time can start this relationship where we can work together. I think that those kind of targeted levels of engagement are things that need to be paid attention to and much more intentional than I think they have been. And I guess we all understand the pros and cons of how foundations, whether community foundation or not, spend their time and resources in cultivating relationships. But there's a lot of value. I mean, if you came to me today and said, I really want you to be involved in this foundation movement, and it's whether it's money or time or your expertise, I would feel something. I would feel a level of commitment if I was approached in that way, even though that I do have something to give, even if it's not some really large check. I kind of think about CMF, M&A, Johnson Center, Commission, all as resource hubs and kind of as parent organizations. And so that any part of the nonprofit sector that you fit into will fall under one of those organizations, whether as a member or a partner in some kind of way. So if you're working at a foundation, you should be in touch with CMF because you can be connected to a network of your peers. Same with M&A and you're at a nonprofit. And actually in my world today, as I talk to nonprofit partners every single day, I'm probably saying M&A all the time, saying, do you know that M&A does this thing? And if I'm talking to foundation peers, I'm saying, CMF has this, you should check out this resource. And so I think of them as resource hubs for different parts of the sector, and that no matter what you do in the sector, you fit into one or more of those categories, and you should be using them as your resource. So I think what prepared me to do that, so my graduate degree was in social work, and within social work I studied social policy and evaluation. So I kind of had the social work lens coming into public policy in that way. And it was very hard. And what I'll tell you was hard about, like you said, when I was younger, walk into the mayor's office, do this, do that, and in my own right I felt like I was making things happen. And then when you get to state government and foundations and you try to make those connections, you can really see how the inherent infrastructure of both sides, in this case, state government and philanthropy, can really either help move work or can hinder the work from moving. And so I will say that experience was, so I served as a public policy fellow for CMF, and it was great because I think I could bring the issues that were important to foundations across a spectrum: health, aging, children and youth, any of those issue areas, and connect it to how policy was happening or not happening at that time in the state. And I think that a lot of people, and Kyle, you and I have been a part of this conversation for a long time now, of can foundations, can philanthropy participate in public policy? Is there a role? And a lot of people just say, oh, we don't do that. But they are doing it. And so I think a lot of my work there was helping my foundation peers understand you are participating in advocacy in this way. These are the things that you're already doing. And if you called it this or you did it in this way, it could elevate the profile of this work. And so there was just a lot of learning, I think, happening on all sides of that conversation to see how foundations could have a louder voice in the space of work that you're already doing. And I think that's something that people can think of as a barrier in public policy participation, because it sounds like that thing over there. But it is definitely something that everyone's participating in, but just to what level of how we can formalize that. And I think that CMF and M&A both provide a lot of tools to do that. So being the fellow at CMF helped me understand what tools actually existed, and then to try my best to help others figure that out too.